Okay, still talking about the Amalekites. Another question that might pop up. But isn't this using a you got to see the big picture approach to avoid accepting responsibility for clear ethical atrocities in the lives of specific individuals? We all know of historical situations in which large-scale perspectives have been abused, but at the same time, they are essential for most large-scale governance issues. In situations involving conflicting ethical demands, sometimes the deadlock can only be broken by big-picture thinking or ethical framework perspectives. In the case of the innocents here, we are facing a moral dilemma that essentially consists of: do we kill them swiftly, or do we let them die slowly, painfully, and agonizingly? Which is more merciful, given no other alternatives that exist? The situation is where there are two undesirable outcomes, and one has to make a choice. In this case, it was God, as to what the most humane choice is. This is similar to this case of unconscious loved ones waiting in pain, untouchable by morphine under some terminal illness, with no hope of regaining consciousness, but still suffering horribly. In our case, however, the suffering of the thirst and starvation disease will be all conscious and until towards the end, and therefore accompanied by despair and pains of dying heart. To try to see the complexity of the governance issues, let's think back to the hypothetical situation that I brought up in an earlier video, in the lifeboat scenario, and I believe that was video number 4 or 3. And I don't have it in front of me, but basically you're a captain of a lifeboat. You're responsible for the lives of the passengers, which for some reason you've been in an accident and there's 30 passengers on a lifeboat, but the boat only supports 29 passengers, and of course you're in shark infested waters. Someone has to get off the boat, or the boat's going to sink and everyone's going to be eaten. So it's either 1 or 29, and it can't be you because you have the skills necessary to save the other 28 victims here. Now, and again, if you're not familiar with the scenario, I encourage you to go back and look. I believe it's video 3 or video 2. It's one of the early ones in this series. And I have it listed in the description box, so it'll be easy to find. Anyway, in the classroom, this discussion proceeds then with what criteria one should use to decide which passenger or crew member should die to save the many. It cannot be you, no matter how badly you wanted to avoid the knowledge that you have killed someone against their will, since your death would pretty much result in the death of the other 29. And I repeat, the I will be the martyr answer is unacceptable, for in your death you are likely to kill the others. If you're the captain, you are forced to live with your choices, which will not be easy. You're important to the lives of the 28 other people. Is it the one who's already enjoyed the longest life? I mean, who should we kill? The one who's already enjoyed the longest life? Is it the one who's made the least contribution to society? Is it the one that least probability of surviving on the island anyway? Is it the one that's likeliest to be a divisive element once ashore? Is it the most morally questionable one involving ethic judgment? Is it the one selected by random processes? Do you take a vote? Do you have last man standing fight with people fighting to throw each other off? Do you pick those with the least number of dependents back in the real world, and so on? Some students will try to avoid this issue altogether, and I've already had skeptics in the video try to do the same silly thing. There are no alternatives. There's no fight. I had one skeptic say he was going to fight the sharks off. You're crazy. You're not thinking. You're not listening. There are no alternatives. There are none. You're not going to fight the sharks off, okay? Life is like that. Real life, okay? But the scenario is not constructed that way. And there must be some other way. It's fantasy world. Fantasy options don't exist. Just in real life, tough decisions. Just like decisions public leaders and government make all the time. If you're the captain, if you, the captain, take a chance and lose all 30 when you could have saved some or most, this is generally considered unacceptable. The death of one person chosen is morally required, but it is only the big picture that justifies the violation of their will. Examining the morality of killing them without placing it in the context of the alternative of killing 30 will not lead one to the ethnically correct and overall humane choice. In fact, in traditional ethical systems, the killing of an individual in this context is not considered legal murder, but falls into justifiable homicide. This principle can be absurd, of course, as we know from countless examples in history. This principle can be abused, of course, as we know from countless examples in history and in the modern world, but this does not invalidate the principle itself. It only highlights the misuse of it. If you as a leader make a moral judgment to decide not to make a choice, this implies you would not only kill the one to save the 29, consequently your moral judgment would be to kill 30. The moral trade-off or dilemma situation actually can be extended in a lifeboat example to an additional sub-scenario. Once you have decided to kill to save the group, how do you kill them? Do you literally throw them off the boat screaming, with them frantically trying to climb back in? Do you tie them up so they cannot jeopardize the boat and throw them to the sharks to be eaten alive as they try to hold their breath? Do you knock them unconscious and throw them in? Do you kill them in the boat by gunshot to head snapping and then throw them in? Are any of these pleasant alternatives? Are there any pleasant alternatives? Of course not. There are stomach-churning, gut-wrenching, heart-hollowing alternatives. The very exercise of thinking through this would deeply disturb any compassionate person. My attempts at the lifeboat scenario over the last couple of years still bring tears and anxiety and feelings of hopelessness to my heart. But when there is no other way out, the toughest choices of one's life have to be made, and these choices and consequences, however important and good, haunt one for the rest of their life, no question about it. But a troubled memory and haunted conscience may be the small price to pay for saving 29 lives. But are some of these alternatives in the lifeboat more humane than others? Absolutely. Normally, one selects the method that would minimize pain and minimize negative effects on the survival chances of the rest of the group. In this case, it would be a swift death in the boat than the more terrifying, painful death by sharks. The implication for our case would be obvious. A swift death for innocents would normally be preferred than greater suffering death in the desert. Of course, we've already saw from the ancient Near Eastern literature that people tended to choose swifter option for themselves well. Now, some might propose that all must die. Some might say that you're the captain, the captain, discuss the matter with the group and get an agreement that all 30 sink and eat deliberately rather than sacrificing someone else, so that 30 can die and with a clean conscience of not having murdered someone. Although it's quite questionable whether they would have shared the responsibility for killing the individual. Of course, your moral responsibilities as captain are rather different. To bring back as many alive as families possible for their families, regardless of what emotional state they're in. A group suicide of this type is certainly not out of the ethical question, but if any one of the 29 does not agree or want to die this way, then you have done the exact same against their will, killing as the traditional sacrifice, plus you have killed more people in the meantime. A variant of this would be not to tell the 30 that the boat will sink until it's too late, forcing them to die with a clean conscience without their consent, but this seems less virtuous than the other alternatives. This is